Hi there, everybody. My name's Barry. I'm doing an interview today on behalf of Aotearoa Workers' Solidarity Movement, which is an anarchist group based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today, I'm interviewing an author, Byron Clark, who's written this book, Fear, New Zealand's Hostile Underworld of Extremists, which came out recently. So this interview is basically going to be about that book and the process of it. Would you like to sorry, not interview, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, like you said, I'm Byron Clark. I'm the author of Fear, New Zealand's Hostile Underworld of Extremists. Been researching the far right for a few years now, with a particular focus on that since the mosque shootings in Christchurch, and this book really is the culmination of that research.
Mm. Well, that leads nicely into really my first question about it. I wanted to ask some big picture questions
Mhm.
about the book. I guess the two questions I had to start with were, how long did it take to write? And why do you think we need such a book at this time?
Mhm. So the manuscript for the book took about 6 months. I had a short deadline in order to get it out for the first anniversary of the Occupation of Parliament protest, and also the fourth anniversary of the mosque shootings. Um, I was, though, able to draw on research that I'd done earlier. I'd written some articles, I'd had a YouTube channel, so I had video essays that I'd done research for, and a bit of the writing happened sort of in the editing stage of the book. So, when you write a book, the manuscript isn't the final product. So, a fair bit more got added after that. So a little bit, maybe a little under a year to get it all together, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. And the second question there,
Yeah. Why do we
hmm,
need a book? I always had writing this book as kind of a long-term goal. When I was doing my YouTube channel, um, I had a Patreon for people to financially support that, and the idea was always, if I can ever get to a position where I can do this as a full-time occupation, I'll dedicate some time to writing a book. And then when the Parliament protest happened, it became sort of clear, like, well, this book needs to exist, and if I got to spend my nights and weekends doing it, then so be it. So I worked a full-time day job, which isn't actually unusual. Most New Zealand authors have day jobs,
it's the
unless they've
demographics, right?
exactly. It's a small market if you're selling a book, particularly if it's really New Zealand focused. There's The book is available in Australia, but I mean, it's a niche topic even here, so I think over there even more so. Um, so yeah, for that 6 months as I was delivering the manuscript, it was a very busy time for me. But yeah, I felt it was important, because particularly after the protest happened, people were asking sort of, who are these people? Where did they come from? And essentially it was people who had been organizing online for years by this point and had been influenced by all this disinformation being spread, both here and stuff from coming in overseas. And now all of them suddenly pouring into Parliament grounds. And I think people were shocked because we have this tendency to still not see the internet as part of real life, as if it's all like some massive online multiplayer game whenever we we log on. But all the people from these Telegram groups, which have thousands of members, they were suddenly there on the streets, and we couldn't ignore them anymore. So I wanted to write a book that would be accessible, not something too academic, something people could go get at their local suburban library or buy at the airport bookshop to read on the plane and learn about, the far right in this country.
So that was actually going to be one of my next questions is who you saw the target audience as being. I mean,
Mm.
do you literally see it as it really could be anybody?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. I mean, there's been a huge amount of well, not all finished yet, but there is a lot of academic work being done on this topic, which is great. I've spoken to in the book, a few academics who are doing research around this, and I've met a few other people who have got the scholarships from Whenua Kora to do research, and that's really good that that's happening. But a lot of that is not going to be as easily available as perhaps my book. Even if it's in like an open access journal, you're not going to see it at the airport bookshop and make an impulse buy. It's
Yeah.
different, and some of the way that academic writing is done isn't necessarily that accessible to someone who doesn't have a university education themselves. So what I did in my book was tried to be really thorough in terms of journalism, but yeah, not too academic, and it's very much narrative journalism. There's a lot of me in there. It's sort of my own story of the last few years woven through with these more academic sources and these other journalists and some of the theories. So, at times it maybe swings a little bit more academic, but I've tried to you know, keep it like, pick it up and read it like it were a novel, even though it's a non-fiction book about a very dreary and serious topic.
Yeah, I personally I quite appreciated that personalized element to it. That
Mm,
if I could imagine somebody who not knowing the subject at all, they could pick this up and say they're with you,
mm,
as you're going along your journey, encountering these people, and you do put some of your personal experiences in there, and I
mm,
quite like that, and I thought overall you hit the balance right. A nod towards the academic side, but also the practical experience and the research aspect that
mm,
you'd obviously done, right?
mm,
Um, so one thing I was curious about is the title.
mm.
How you arrived at the title, because I mean, for a book, obviously, you shouldn't judge books by their cover. We all know that. But how did that come about? Was it your decision? Was it the publishers?
Ultimately, the publishers. I we had a working title of Radical, which mostly I didn't know what to call it. And I said, "Yep, okay, sure, whatever. We'll find a title by the end of it." And I quite liked perhaps calling it River of Filth, which ended up instead being one of the chapter titles in there. Um, but one word titles are, really in at the moment for publishing. If you go to a bookstore, you'll see these big, bold one word titles. And I thought maybe not radical, because I think of the word radical, I associate it more with the left wing than the right wing, and radical, the etymology of it's the same etymology as the word radish. It's from the Latin for root. It's about getting to the root of problems. So I think being a radical is quite a positive thing. So we ended up going with fear, thinking, here's one word that encapsulates really what is happening. It's movements who are trying to make us fearful. I mean, that's a lot of what terrorism is, and even the non-terrorist actions that we're seeing, like some of the intimidation. Like I write about one of these people coming to my workplace, for example.
Mm,
It's about trying to instill fear. Um, and at the same time, this whole movement is really driven by fear. It's fear of losing the privilege and the power that you have in society, whether that's, the privilege you have as a man or as a white person, or, some of these other privileged groups, fear of migrants, fear of feminism and the social changes that come about from that, fear of LGBTQI rights, which we've seen just this last weekend.
yeah.
So, fear is a word that draws your attention in the bookstore, but also lets me talk about this sort of stuff, like what is the fear that's happening right now.
It's perhaps the underlying commonality between the disparate movements that you talk about, isn't it, really?
Mm, yeah.
I sort of feel myself that, yeah, based on what you've written, that they're not offering, other than a sense of nostalgia and sense of loss,
Mm,
which has you could say had a poetic tinge to it if you're sympathetic to it. It they don't seem to offer anything for the future that's a positive replacement to what their mythical past that they want to hold on to.
mm,
That's the fear, isn't it? It's they haven't got a liberatory sort of program to offer as an alternative to
no.
the future. It's just hold on to what we had, and
Mm,
uh, make New Zealand great again, sort of thing.
mm,
Yeah. Mm. Um, I was wondering, basically the structure of the book, because what sort of leapt out at me was, I suppose, chapter 18, which is the history white history of New Zealand, if you like,
Mm,
which looks at the discriminatory practices in the legal sense of it. And I wondered why, because you've got quite a few chapters in the book, why you left that chapter so late in the book, whereas I thought
mm,
maybe that would be a good lead in and maybe the first couple of chapters, just to background and
mm,
contextualize what's happened, because I think, although I would agree with you that the internet has made a huge difference and that's been quite transformative, there is that deep sort of prehistoric, well, not prehistoric, but history there, right?
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I think I made the call to put it later in the book, and along with the chapter that follows that on New Zealand's relationship historically with Rhodesia and apartheid South
Mm.
Africa. Those are the two I think of as the history chapters. And I am by trade a historian, so I was going to have some history chapters in there, and they could have come at the beginning and contextualized some stuff, but I think what I wanted to do really was have people's full attention by the time they got to that point in the book.
Uh,
Bring them and look at the Gamergate as I do in the first chapter, and look at the white nationalists, and then when people are sort of reading through, then get to actually there's this whole history that you need to know, because it's not just some imported thing, or if it is, it was imported on the colonizing ships of the British Empire, not by 4chan or whatever. So I think, having those in there when people are a bit more primed to start reading it. And I think it's possibly upset a couple of readers, people who perhaps have a more centre-right persuasion, picking up the book, wanting to read about, sig-hailing neo-Nazis, making terror cells or whatever, and then finding that the book is very much about the roots of white supremacy and colonization, and the problems of alt-right radicalization being in neoliberalism, and then they're getting a bit affronted by that, or affronted by the way that I've shown how some of these ideas actually aren't that far from the mainstream, aren't that far from our recent history. I think that can be challenging to people. So perhaps by getting to it later in the book, I'm getting most people at a point where they're ready to be challenged.
I see. I appreciate that. I quite like that. I guess also it's that point that, a certain contingent of the readership don't want to be hit over the head with what appears like a history lesson immediately, right?
Mm.
You want to draw
Yeah,
them in.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I can see how that would
yeah.
work. Yeah, I found it was a very powerful point that you made in that chapter where you said, there's no date we can point to say that there was a day colonization ended.
Mm.
The breaks and continuities that historians look at, you're saying full on, well, in a sense, it's still there,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Yeah. I've found that quite powerful. So yeah, okay. Just before I get into some of the chapter specific content, I was just curious, is there any topic which ultimately, or movement perhaps, that didn't get included, that for some reason either you felt it wasn't substantial enough, you didn't have enough material, or it didn't occur to you till afterwards? Do you think, oh, if I was going to do a revised version in the future, I might
Mm.
include these people? Anything like that?
No, not probably not enough material that there'd be like a whole other chapter on something.
Mm,
But maybe some things that could be expanded on a bit there. I did have in my initial plan for the book, having a chapter on the soldier who was arrested and was part of a far right group, had been part of a couple, at least two far right groups, and he's still awaiting court martial. And when I started to plan out the book, I thought surely the court martial will have happened and he'll have lost his name
mm,
suppression, and I can do a whole chapter on him. And so, um, instead of there being a chapter on him, there's sort of bits about him in a couple of other chapters based on what we know before the court martial and what we can publish with the name suppression that's there. So he's not named, but what's already been reported in the media, and a little bit of perhaps some additional info is in there, without breaking any name suppression orders. So when that court martial does happen, there'll hopefully be another article at least to be written about him. Um, I if I'd been thinking ahead, I would have archived a lot more from Vargas Creste, which was one of the groups he was in, to write a bit more about them. Although that said, they're gone now. They're a bit of a footnote really in the recent history of the far right. So maybe they don't need a whole chapter anyway. Um, I'm glad that I did the chapter on the alt-right adopting traditionalist Catholicism. That's something that was kind of very new when I started writing, and I was sort of thinking, oh, is this even a thing? I get a bit of
Mm,
imposter syndrome, and I want to look,
mm,
are there other researchers like overseas picking this up? And they were, but it was still very new. Um, so I'm glad that I wrote about that because that seems to be becoming more of a thing. These young men, adopting this worldview to give a spiritual veneer to their politics. So I'm glad I wrote about that, and I think if I were writing the book now, potentially I could write even more on that topic. Um, so yeah, not really a lot I left out, but more that the book's not the end of the story of the far right in New Zealand. You
mm,
know.
mm. Yeah, it's constantly evolving, isn't it?
Mm,
Yeah, I guess that ties into a way a criticism that I've heard amongst people I've mentioned, hey, I'm reading this book, and
mm,
I haven't told them that I'm going to be talking to you at all.
mm,
It's not a criticism I share, by the way, but they've said to me, well, yeah, okay, I've heard of this person and that person, but they're saying, well, these groups are extremely small, like why bother? Like honestly, why
mm,
bother? And you've just supplied an example of a group that was very limited in its impact in some ways as a
mm.
group. How would you counter that sort of argument?
Yeah, well, I think we need to counter the far right while they're small. It's a lot easier to counter them while they're small than while they're big. It's like, can we sit down and talk about what is the size that the far right needs to be at before we start fighting back?
Yeah.
I think, there probably is a level of too small where they're not worth bothering with. There is actually one group that I do monitor who like picked up the book and then were a bit indignant that they weren't in it. And it's and it's a group of people who sort of centered around this like publishing company. This, well, I say publishing company. It's one guy who prints books. And he vehemently anti-Semitic and Islamophobic, but equally anti-Christian. And he believes that we've got to go back to we've got to return even further than like you know European Christendom and go back to these kind of more like the kind of polytheistic religions of ancient Greece or whatever, and not specifically that. I think he's actually made his own religion. It's all very weird, but he's got a few followers, and they're kind of an interesting curiosity, but they're a bit out of step with most of the far right because there's a real influence of particular strands of Christianity, like we talked a bit about. Traditionalist Catholicism, there's a strong Protestant contingent there, and even among those who aren't particularly religious, when they talk about the West, they're not thinking of ancient Greece so much as they're thinking of you know um, um, 1950s Europe or whatever, before the immigrants or things like that, rather than wanting to return to the classical era. So that group was kind of so small. It's like I'm not going to spend too much time researching them, looking into them. Um, but when you look at something like, the New Conservative Party, where I write about, yeah, they're only polling at 1.5%, which is not enough to get into Parliament. But and I use this overseas example in the Afterward because around time I was writing the Afterward, Italian election happened, and now the Brothers of Italy are leading a coalition government, the first far right government in Italy since Mussolini, and that party got 2% of the vote in 2012. 2012 to 2023, a little over a decade, they've gone from fringe, could be ignored, to leading the government. And I think there is a possibility of that happening here, perhaps not with one of the existing parties, but with the ideologies that are there, something could happen, whether it's a existing party sort of pivoting further to the right, or whether it's some new party, it could grow from something small to something significant. And significant in a New Zealand context could be, 5% in deciding who gets to be the government. And, even if they're in opposition, then suddenly they get the whole infrastructure of, parliamentary staff, and they can do communications with the electorate, and they can travel and, speak at events with their flights paid for, and like all this stuff, helps them grow further. So, get them while they're small. Don't wait till they're in parliament and have all those resources. Challenge them while they're trying to build to that.
Absolutely. I guess the historical example was always the Nazis, wasn't it? They were polling at something similar to that, and then look what happened there.
Mm,
And yeah, there's tons of recent examples around Europe, aren't there, of small groups that
mm,
they're in power or close to being in power or being very influential.
mm,
Oh, one question I was going to ask. I'm thinking of it in terms of the accessibility of the book.
mm.
There's no index.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the publisher's call to make. That's yeah, that's a bit of a shame because yeah, it would be useful. There is an ebook available which is searchable, but yeah, unfortunately, no index in the printed version.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Um, so turning more now into just some of the chapters, and I don't want to add too many spoilers or whatever, but I've
Yeah.
got a few notes here. Um, I guess the first comment I was going to make, sort of in the early chapters there, you do make an effort, and I assume it's for reasons of just general accessibility, that you do define some terms. For
Mm,
example, based as a
yeah.
expression, deep state, LARPing,
Mm,
demonetized. I found it interesting your choice of the ones that you decided to define, because I wondered if you
mm,
had an age thing in mind there, that some of the older
mm,
readers might not be familiar with some of those terms. I was wondering firstly, what determined your choice of the words that you defined. Secondly, what could be taken more of as a criticism, perhaps,
mm,
is a taxonomy, perhaps, or a definition of what constitutes the far right,
mm,
and what the different gradations are. We've got these different words, alt right and far right, and to what extent are they interchangeable? And
mm, mm.
obviously, as you said, you didn't want to make it a purely academic thing. I mean, people write thick books on nothing but that thing alone, like what is
Mm.
fascism or something,
Yeah.
So how did you weigh that up in the writing, and yeah.
Yeah. So when I did the initial manuscript, there were a few things where I thought, I should, define this a little bit. There were a lot more that I didn't think to define, and then the first editor would ask me to define or find a definition. Um, some of them I think you can maybe tell are like put in by an editor, like the definition of Antifa, which because I'm so familiar with some of these terms, like whether it's
Mm.
Antifa or whether it's like 8chan. You forget that not everybody knows what 8chan is, even though it was in the news a bit around the time of the mosque shooting.
Yeah.
It's not like a household brand exactly.
Yeah.
It's not like Coca-Cola. You might know what Coca-Cola is, or Hoover, or Kleenex, but you won't
Yeah.
know 8chan or 4chan or or
Yeah.
whatever. So a few of those got sort of suggested to me by their first editor, like, can you define what this is? And yeah, some of that was terms that might be familiar to the extremely online or the heavily online, like when we talk about demonetized and deplatformed and that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, it was just really really good having that editor had to be kind of representative of the audience in a way, and like not being super familiar with this world and being able to point out what needs to be defined further or explained further. Um, and then the defining some of the bigger, broader terms like far right, alt right, and so forth is a bigger question. It's one sort of criticism that came out in a review that Chris Wilson did. Chris Wilson's runs the Masters in Counterterrorism Studies at Auckland University, and his review was generally really positive. But then, sort of in the second half, he said that the criticisms were not defining terms, and I felt a little bit like maybe he's approaching this the way he might approach a thesis he was marking, where you would want to define these really clearly, whereas, the book's not that kind of academic publication. It is narrative journalism. So you're not going to end up with these really clearly defined sort of terms that are then used for an analysis. I did just in one of the chats with the first editor, because she'd said, she'd pointed out how rarely I use the word neo-Nazi, and like sometimes I'll cite a article like from Stuff where they'll say neo-Nazi, and but I'll call them something else. And she said, why not call them neo-Nazi? That's what Stuff's called here. And I think the word Nazi is a little bit overused, because it does refer to a more specific kind of political worldview, whether you're saying Nazi or neo-Nazi, than what I think is a very broad movement that, with the exception of a few individuals, wouldn't really adhere to Nazism. There's a book I really found really valuable, by the Italian historian Enzo Traverso, called "The New Faces of Fascism, Populism, and the Far Right." Came out in 2019, and he talks about how, well, he uses the terms post-fascism and neo-fascism. Neo-fascism being movements that have a continuity with 20th century fascism, whether that's Nazism or like Italian fascism or Spanish. And then he uses post-fascism, which is new movements that are not in continuity with those 20th century movements, but when you're a historian, that's the historical point that makes for the best comparison when analyzing them. And I think that's gets a little bit at the difference between the way I'm writing and the way that Chris Wilson was like reviewing, because I think when you're a historian, it is harder to be precise around these terms, because we talked about earlier the history of white New Zealand chapter. New Zealand had a official white New Zealand policy from 1920 to 1974. Does that mean we had a far right government in the 60s? I mean, by today's standards, if you had a party calling for, blocking immigration from almost everyone who's not white, without, putting up a few sort of hurdles and things to stop them getting here, we'd probably say, well, that's a really far right position, but it's a mainstream bipartisan political view in this country 100 years ago, or even more recently than that. I mean, 74, very much living memory for some people. And our immigration policy since then has still favored, northern Western Europeans more than it's favored people from other parts of the world. So it can be difficult to define far right, because it's broadly speaking the position that you take as relative to what the political center is, and what the political center has shifted significantly over the last century. You could argue it. It's shifted socially to be more multicultural and more tolerant of different groups, and economically it's shifted to be much more laissez-faire neoliberalism compared to the welfare state that we had, and that welfare state was partly propped up by having racial immigration controls and things too. So that's a whole other conversation. But so it becomes difficult to define far right because of that. And alt-right I use a little bit interchangeably, but I see the alt-right as being a alternative to the older kind of neo-Nazi movements, like the National Front that we had here in the 90s and 2000s, which doesn't really exist anymore, although a few individuals from it are around, and also an alternative to mainstream conservatism. And a lot of this grew online, among sort of men around my age, people who came of age after the 2008 recession. And at that time, coming out of the end of the Bush years, it was still deeply uncool to be a conservative. And I remember the kind of the early days of like Gamergate, they'd say, no, no, we're not. It's not about left wing, right wing. We're not right wing. We're libertarian versus authoritarian. It's just that, feminists are authoritarian now. And I mean, that was there like 2014, 2015. And now they've completely abandoned that and be like, yeah, we're the alternative right. We're an alternative to, Bush era conservatism, but also, we're not these shaved head swastika tattoo types either. So I've used it quite broadly. I do understand that some people, when they're writing, will use alt-right more narrowly and use it only to refer to like white supremacist groups. And I use it more broadly than that, partly because even, yeah, like we were saying before, white supremacy can be hard to define because it was New Zealand a white supremacist country for most of the 20th century and so forth. So um, yeah, so I've been, I guess, maybe not deliberately vague, but haven't let myself be too pinned down by giving very, very precise definitions of what are broad terms that can change their meaning based on time and place.
And as you said, your approach is perhaps that less strictly narrow academic thing where
Mm,
you're going to worry about every little nuance of everything. You want to get the story out there, right? And it's
yeah,
it's
yeah.
enough to hang a hat on that people can follow. Yeah, okay, I get the idea.
Yeah,
Basically,
and
what we're talking about. Yeah.
even that kind of criticism that might come from like someone like Chris Wilson, I welcome that. I think it adds to the discussion.
Mm,
And there's there was a response to that then written by Mohan Datta, who's one of the academics I interviewed for the book. Where he well, not so much about the definition stuff, but about the idea of evidence and so he wrote about like what gets to be considered evidence by academia, and when you're talking to affected people, you know, are their stories evidence enough, or do you need something more? And I think that's a really important conversation too. Like the whole idea of like what is knowledge? What is knowledge? What is evidence? When we're talking about the far right, you want to go and talk to the people they're targeting as much as you want to talk to somebody who might be studying this academically and publishing in journals. I think you got to mix have a mix of both, and that the book does a bit of that. So I think all the criticism like that has been useful because it adds to the broader conversation that we're having as a society. And I think my book's just one contribution to that conversation. And there's other books, other articles, other media of different types, and it's all very useful. And I certainly say to people, don't make my book the only source that you read on the far right. Read histories of hate, read fake believe, read a lot. There's lots of ones from overseas that are really good as well. So
yeah, I mean, it could be a starting point for someone's journey, perhaps, and they can
mm,
perhaps look at some of the articles that you reference, and that they can leap off into that, if that's
mm,
their way in, as you say. And I
yeah.
guess everyone can approach it in different styles, different registers, and so on. And as long as
Mm,
it's making its contribution, yeah. I mean,
mm,
I can see, as you said, somebody at an airport going, "What's that all about?" and picking
mm,
that up, and it could lead them to sort of find out a lot more, and they can take that in lots of directions, right? If they want to get all, heavy and academic, they're welcome to. If that's as far as they get, well, they've learnt more than they did before, I suppose. You know, I
mm,
can I can see its place.
yeah.
I've just noticed our time. Yeah, I've got about 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
What we might do, what I might suggest, is that we possibly break this into
Yeah,
parts
we
for the
can.
future or something.
Okay, yeah, sure. We
Yeah,
can do like a second part and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. While I'm on that note, then, I was going to leave this till the end, but I'll slip it in now, and then we'll close for now.
Mhm.
In terms of, this is your first book, right?
It's the first book I've written. Yeah, I have a
Yeah.
an oral history project that I self-published a couple of years back, but I don't consider that a book I've written because it's transcriptions of interviews. It's
It
not
writes
not the
itself.
same. It writes
Yeah,
itself. Yeah, it
yeah,
writes itself. And
yeah.
but other than that, yeah, this is my first real book. Yeah.
Yeah. Congratulations, by the way. I don't think I've said that. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah.
I guess the question I had around that is, what do you have in mind for any future projects? Would they
Mm.
be in the same subject area? Are you intending to publish something else, branch into another field of interest? What do
Yeah, yeah. So I'm doing a fair bit. The YouTube channel's on a hiatus. It was a lot of work producing video essay content, regularly. I got to the point where I wanted to be getting something out every month. But realistically it just wasn't possible while working full time and writing a book. And so the most recent content on my YouTube channel is some interviews that I did, which are a bit less work than video essays. And those interviews are often people who I interviewed for the book, and we just sort of two birds, one stone, did that for YouTube too. So I may pick up doing videos again at some point in the future, depending on where my life leads, because it's, I think, a really accessible format for material, and it's also a good creative outlet, more so than maybe a lot of writing. But I'm doing a bit of long form writing. I've started a Substack called Fajora Dispatch, where just putting out sort of an article a month at this stage. And an advantage of that over YouTube is that I am been commissioning freelancers to do things too, which you can't really do with a video essay, but you can with an article, because it's not the same amount of resource. You don't need a editor and all these other things. Well, not a video editor, which is different skill than
Yeah.
text. I'm also writing an article for the academic journal Pacific Journalism Review, who have written 4 before. They're doing a review of the book, and initially wanted to publish some of the book, but the publisher wasn't too keen on having a big chunk of the book freely available. So I'm picking up a little bit on one of the points the book leaves off on, which is the pivot to climate change conspiracy theories from COVID conspiracy theories. So I'll be looking at that a little bit deeper than what I do in the book, like looking at the origins of these conspiracies around like Agenda 21 with the John Birch Society, and how that then spread through like Billy Tikahika, and where things are going now with Counterspin and Voices for Freedom, what we've seen since the cyclones. So that's going to be out about mid-year. And then depending on that, I might use that as a basis to go do like some postgraduate study if I were to, write about something that could be a topic there, the climate change conspiracy stuff, which could be, be more academic at least to start with, but then in the future it could become another book. But
Absolutely.
things may change between now and then. But that's a
Yeah.
vague plan I've got.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
there's always stuff to write about. In
yeah,
this case, somewhat unfortunately, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
but great. Oh, that sounds really good. Well, we'll definitely talk again, I hope.
Okay,
And I've got some further questions I can ask you next time.
excellent.
I really appreciate it. Thanks very much, Byron.
Thank you.
It's great. Thank you.
Cheers.